When Todd Orr scrambled to his feet after a terrifying grizzly attack, he thanked the Lord he'd survived and hobbled towards his vehicle. But a rustle in the undergrowth, and the bear is back to finish what she started. This is the incredible true story of a man who survived not one, but two grizzly bear attacks in the same day. Todd Orr was scouting for elk for the upcoming season in Montana's Madison Valley. He had just 3 days before the season opened and wanted to get a head start on the prime location of any elk in the area. He began his scouting mission before dawn. In the darkness of fall, the air was crisp. Not wanting to startle any bears every 30 seconds or so, he hollered into the blackness of the forest. Only his footsteps sounded on the ground. It was a peaceful time to be out and about. But after 3 miles of hiking, something else was waiting for him in the clearing. Just ahead of him, at a fork in the trail, there was a grizzly sow and her 2 cubs. The second Todd saw her, she turned and saw him. Their eyes locked and Todd froze. A second later, the grizzly ran away along the western trail, and Todd watched as they disappeared from sight over a ridge. He waited for a minute to make sure they were gone before continuing along the eastern trail in the opposite direction from the bears. Todd had only made it a few yards along the trail when he heard a rustling over his left shoulder. It was the bear. She was back. But worse still, she was thundering towards him. She tore down from the ridge 40 yards away. Her eyes were locked onto Todd's. He couldn't believe the speed of the thing. She covered the distance in mere seconds. Instantly, Todd pulled his canister of pepper spray from its holster, yanked out the safety ring, and released the spray at the bear. But it did nothing to stop her. She was in a full charge and rampaged through the cloud of spray without flinching. Todd threw himself on the ground. He wrapped his arms around the back of his neck and pressed his face into the dirt, hoping and half expecting the bear to gallop past him. But she didn't. She towered over him and bit down on his arm, shoulder, and back. The adrenaline was masking the pain, but he could feel the pressure of every bite. But as quickly as she had arrived, she disappeared. Todd let out a breath and sat up. He looked around nervously, scanning the undergrowth for any sign of the bear. When he was satisfied that she had gone back to her cubs, he got to his feet and checked himself over. The damage wasn't life-threatening. He had deep gauges and cuts, but it was clear that he would survive this if he could just get back to his truck without further incident. Todd picked up his cap and half-empty can of bear spray and immediately headed back to his vehicle. It was a relief to be moving away from the bear, and he walked as quickly as he could to put as much distance between them. This would be one hell of a story to tell him mates back home, if he made it back. All of a sudden, there came another crashing sound. Todd wheeled around and couldn't believe his eyes. It was the bear again. She was charging towards him along the trail. She had either followed him or, unfortunately, chose that moment to step down onto the same path. Todd didn't have time to release his pepper spray nor unleash his sidearm. She was upon him before he even had time to think. Just like before, Todd flung himself to the ground. He didn't know if he could survive a second attack. He was just counting his blessings from the first one and thanking the Lord for protecting him. He didn't know if he could go through it all again. Todd tucked himself up into a ball, trying to protect his neck, face, and vitals. He clasped his hands together, interlocking his fingers behind his neck. He squeezed his eyes shut and braced himself for what was coming. The bear leapt on him, her full weight pressing down on him. Then she began biting him all over again. Todd couldn't believe this was happening for a second time, but this time the attack seemed far more ferocious. The bear was being more aggressive, more powerful with her bites. And then came a loud crunch. She had bitten down to the bone on Todd's left arm, and his hand went limp. Todd let out a gasp of pain, which seemed to send the bear into a frenzy. He knew now that he had to remain completely motionless and silent. He didn't want to provoke her further. So he lay there and endured what she gave him. She would pick him up, a foot or two off the ground in her vice-like jaws, and then drop him repeatedly. Todd thought that the bear must stop soon. She must need to go and check on her cubs and leave him alone. Surely. He knew that with every bite he was just inches away from death. All it would take would be one bite on an artery, and he would bleed out there on the trail. After what seemed like an eternity, the bear stopped biting him. Todd couldn't make out what she was doing as he was pressed the ground. Her two front paws were pushing heavily down on his lower back, stopping him from moving. He could now smell her stench. It was an overpowering, pungent aroma. Blood trickled into Todd's eyes, and the trees and woodland turned into a nightmarish blur. Then, the bear stepped off Todd. He resisted the urge to take in a deep breath, to inflate his lungs after being compressed under hundreds of pounds of weight. Instead, he didn't move. He knew he definitely wouldn't survive a third attack. So, he moved his head very slowly, trying to see around him. Then, before getting up or looking the other way, he slowly moved his right arm from behind his neck and slipped it under his chest, feeling for his gun which was holstered there. But there was no holster and no gun. Where had it gone? Todd couldn't tell. Very gradually, he lifted his head off the ground and looked around him. He expected the bear to pounce on top of him again, but to his immense relief, he didn't see her. Still lying on the ground, straining his neck, he could see his gun lying on the ground a few yards away. His holster lay next to it, torn and shredded. Quickly, he dived for the gun and flicked back the hammer, pointing it all around him. But the bear still wasn't there. He picked up his hat, bear spray, and holster and began making his way to his vehicle once more. This time, he walked even quicker than before. He was terrified the sow would come after him again. There was no phone signal in the area, and there was no one else about. He was on his own. He tried to jog along the trail, but the pounding motion was too painful for his battered and torn arm that hung limp from his body. Besides, he didn't want to increase his heart rate too much for fear of losing too much blood. He paused only to assess his injuries. It was a grueling 45-minute hike back to the trailhead where his vehicle was waiting for him. He rushed up to it, grabbed a jacket to put onto the driver's seat to stop the blood from staining, and climbed in. When he slammed the door shut behind him, he finally felt safe. There was one other car in the parking lot. Todd hoped that whoever it belonged to wouldn't run into the same bear. It was only 8 a.m., and he contemplated leaving a note at the trailhead to warn others. But he struggled to find a piece of paper in his truck, and with blood pouring down his arms and hands, it most likely would have been illegible anyway. Inside his truck, he took a few deep breaths before documenting his injuries on his phone. Then he turned the key in the ignition and began the 30-minute drive to hospital. With still no phone signal, Todd pulled into a driveway where a local was checking his mail. He asked him to call the hospital to let them know that he was on his way and needed help. The man offered to give him a lift himself, but Todd knew he'd get there quicker if he just kept on the road. He didn't feel faint or as though he was going to pass out, so he knew he could make it on his own. When his phone finally pinged back into life, Todd called his girlfriend to let her know what had happened. Then he dialed 911 to explain the situation he was in and where he was headed. To his immense relief, when he arrived at the emergency department in Ennis, staff were waiting for him. He was ushered into surgery. It took 8 hours to repair his ripped and torn body. He received multiple stitches for the deep gashes and puncture wounds on his arms, shoulders, and back. His ulna was chipped and 2 tendons had been ripped from the muscle in his left forearm. That required more surgery to reattach those and try to repair the nerve damage too. The 5-inch gash along the side of his head above his ear was stitched back together but left a nasty scar, a constant reminder of the day he survived not 1, but 2 bear attacks.